Okay, so boa tarde, good afternoon. So we're going to start the last panel of the day. In case you need, there is more coffee here. So the panel this afternoon, the title is China and India in Latin America, Economic Engagement and Interest. We will have, my name is Claudia Fuentes. I'm not the original chair. As you know, Sandra Destrati could not be here with us, so this is why I'm chairing. At the same time, we made a small change. Instead of having 4 presenters, we will have 3. And Ambassador Renjarak will be presenting tomorrow, but he will definitely be presenting, but we move him just tomorrow. So we will have 3 presenters. Each one we have more or less 25 minutes. That's fine. And we'll check the time since we already started. Yes, we already started a little late. So we're going to be a little careful with time. Also because to have enough time for questions and answers, which in my view that always the most fun part of the talks. So let me start introducing Marcos Costa Lima. Marcos holds a postdoctoral from the Universidade de Paris. He has a PhD from Unicamp. He is professor of the Political Science Department of UFPE, coordinator of the Asia Studies Institute at the same UFPE, and is a member of the board of directors of the Celso Furtado International Center in Rio de Janeiro. And he will be speaking this afternoon. The title is The Dragon is Thinking, Building a Theory of International Relations with a Chinese Profile.
Thank you. I prepare something for this seminar that I'm not used to work with. I work with theory of international relations, but not with the Chinese theory of international relations. I work with economic policy. But first, I start to try to understand China 6 years ago, and the first thing in international relations that I felt discomfortable, it was that in Brazil we used to try to understand China by the American literature or the British literature. And okay. So, and these provoked me to go more deep into the Chinese culture. And in the Chinese writer. And I begin with, it is not here, it's a phrase that I like very much of Edward Said in Orientalism, when he said that I defend the point of view that there is a difference between knowledge of other people and ages, resulting understanding, compassion, study, and careful analysis of the interests of themselves, and on the other hand, knowledge, if that it comes to knowledge, integrated into a comprehensive campaign of self-affirmation, belligerency, and declare war. And if we look what we are finding these days in the literature for the rising of China, for instance, if you read or listen to Mishheimer, he said that it's impossible, the rise of China, without confronting, without a war or something in that direction. And all these my interest is the desire for knowledge for reasons, not for reasons of control and foreign domination. And I am with Said in this direction. So my presentation, it will be more in the Chinese theory of international relations, but I want to contextualize this thing. First, only a chart from Chinese rise, and the second some chart to the China back to normal. Because I think that these moments influence the Chinese thought or thinkers in international relations to do this before. So, these, we saw something like this. I took from medicine. It's the data from 71 to 2008, the percentage of growth from developed countries, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and industrialized countries. Something was talked about these in the morning. But we can see that from 71 until this day, the developed countries sustain the growth in the world, mainly in Asia. And this process of Asia being the center of the system, of the capitalist system, it comes from the Japanese model after passing by the tigers and after the flying geese, and now with China leading the process. And China back to normal, it's this real GDP growth rate. It's really is a fell from 19.3 in 2015, 6.8, and they expect that until 2020, China is still growing in 6.3%, which means this is a lot compared what are doing the Western center states. Okay, this is another a breakup of the Chinese GDP. One thing that I want to show with this Chinese GDP is that the tertiary industry, as they call, is already passing the secondary industry, and this is still very low if we compare with the industrialized countries, which Brazil is not a complete industrialized country, but the tertiary industry in Brazil is about 65%, and with a very low secondary sector of industry. And this is the movement in the tertiary industry value added in China from 1983 to 2003. And this is another chart that is important because we see that the agricultural value added in China is falling it's very deep, and saying also that the Chinese, even the value added is falling like this, the workers working in agriculture in China is still huge. I will pass rapidly to the current Chinese geopolitics, and I took Susan Strange to give me some help on this, but I understand that Susan Strange didn't consider one element that I think that is fundamental in this kind of reflection, which is culture. Should be knowledge, but not culture. So security, production, finance, knowledge, and culture would be a more complete analysis. So, from the military point of view, even with the break-in, China has motivation and resource to keep growing in this sector. Okay? And we know that China is working on that. The legitimacy of the Communist Party is, in good measure, pressed by the great rejuvenation of the nation, a concept that includes the claim on the islands that are in dispute the airspace and the expansion of the South and its Chinese seas. Which means, I think that China with the strong rise that balance completely the capitalist system of our days is provoking also China to respond mainly to the central of the capitalist system, mainly United States and Japan. So the President Xi Jinping has amply demonstrated its interest in pursuing this goal of rejuvenation of the nation, partly accelerating the transformation of the People Liberation Army into a world-class fighting force with operations well beyond Asia. So, a less exuberant economy should increase the importance to Beijing to maintain a peaceful regional environment so that it can expand trade and investment with its neighbor. There is a slight contradiction. At the same time that China needs to amplify his army and all his capabilities in armies, but mainly with the concept that I will bring for you here of Tianxia, all under heaven is the translations that it uses, all equal under heavens. That is the main part of my explanation. But at least China don't confront the United States saying that it wants to be, that it will be a next hegemon and things like this. It is evident that the great efforts made by the Chinese to consolidate multilateralism for one side, significant examples are on the BRICS and the Bank of BRICS created 2 years ago in Fortaleza, and the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So China is doing a strong effort to have a more important role in the finance sector, which we know is mainly a sector of the capitalist economy nowadays. On the other hand, the gigantic project of One Belt, One Road, with estimates of more than 1 trillion investments in infrastructure projects, which will require many years for its implementation. If successful, it will create a powerful economic belt across Eurasia. Summing all these informations, what I want to say is that China has done, is coming back to normal, but it still is quite ahead of the other Western countries, developed countries. But China needs not only to I wouldn't say confront, but to the idea of defense its territory, trying to balance mainly Europe, Japan, and United States. And the present situation, geopolitical situation with Russia shows a lot of this necessity of, and also to do a very strong, strategy with Latin America and Africa in terms of Pacifico cooperation, in terms of so this is the Silk Road economic belt, which is also a necessity, a deep necessity for the Chinese future. Chinese has a need, a tremendous need of work every year. People that comes to the market, and this project is very necessary. I took very bosom that he believes that China is likely to maintain its rise peacefully. Unlike Michiheimer, he believes that the project is feasible. However, that will be much harder than it has been in the last 3 decades. China will have to strongly think about it, even on its internal issues and internal society, in which today is one of the largest players. So China represents not only itself in these days, but with its economy, in the economy of Asia, in the economy of everywhere in the world. China has to respond for that rising. This process in a crisis we are living in a crisis without perspective to end, will create strong tensions with the United States, Japan, without being able to repeat that successful experience since 1978. I think that the One Belt, One Road is a response to this. The country is better positioned than most of the great powers to do well and cannot keep a comfortable distance of the problem now faced by the West because it's now a great power. These are the 4 pillars that are intrinsic to the Chinese foreign policy: maintenance of the territorial integrity, recognition by the international community of the policy of one China, promote the economic development of the country, increase its prestige in the international arena. And I think that China is being successful in all these, and this would be achieved in the theory of the peaceful rise that Ru Jintao presented. So I will give only some elements of these, what is happening in terms of international relations theory in China. In the first movements in China, from the 70s, 60s, 70s, I would say even the 50s, the Marxist theory was very strong in China until, let's see, until then, when the opening came, and bit by bit they start to introduce all the main theories of the Western, realist theory, a bit of English school, which is very admired by the Chinese, and constructivism. And they translate mainly the main masterpiece of this theory, but repeating from the international relations thought what Deng has said, China with socialism with Chinese characteristics. They try to think this about China, to introduce in the reflection of international theory the characteristics, the Chinese characteristics. And the magnitude and importance that the country gained after the victory of Mao Zedong revolution has caused the Chinese social scientists to reflect on the main thing, on the making of their academic subject, hitherto very subordinate to the Western codex. Until the 90s, the Western codex was dominating. So, the beginning of the intellectual movement in China. So, inside China is emerging an effort to promote some of the principles inspired by Confucius toward building a more collectivist order, a harmonious alternatives to the conflictual individualism that took account of which took account of the Western international relations. And if we think about the Hobbesian theory that is the basis of realism and and the Kantian theory of idealism and so on. And some authors in China starts to reflect deeply on that. I only pick up some of them. There are plenty today, and some I divide in three main authors. So the Chinese tradition is very consistent in this direction, and I myself start to feel the necessity to really seriously and try to understand the Confucian thinking, but not only Confucius, of Laozi, of Han Feizi, of Mencius, which take time to do this, to really try to understand. For us on the West, maybe this idea, this concept of Tianxia could seem very romanticized or very, but I think that is without this going back in history, we cannot understand the real Chinese thought. The Chinese tradition is consistent. As said King, the theory fits from culture, develops from it, and gains universality by interaction with other cultures. Thus, taking the perspective of the concept of Tianxia, world order, universe, and the practice of the tax system, they are backed a deep structure 3,500 years, allowing the country to start the size of a large civilization. And if they have all this complexity in their culture and influencing the government and so on, why they have to be tributary of the Western conceptualization? This is so the idea of harmony, peace, cooperation are important values in Chinese culture, which are in addition to Confucian thought, according to which human nature is correctable or potentially ready for good. This is completely upside if we look for Hobbesian and Machiavellian main structure of thinking. The Confucian humanism says that what determines human nature are the effects that affect the human environment, society, and perfected by moral education. In the field of international relations, one called Chinese school of thought that seeks to merge aspects of political realism. This was in the beginning, but today they are getting strong into rebuild this kind of understanding the position of China in the world politics with these concepts they bring to the theory. So they go to the Qing dynasty until today, and so Tianxia is a cultural concept of ancient China that denotes both the geographical world and the kingdom of mortals, and later become associated with political sovereignty. In ancient China, Tianxia denoted the land, space, and area divinely attributed to the emperor by universal principles and well-defined order. The center of this land was directly attributed to the imperial court, forming the center of a worldwide that was centered in the imperial court and was concentrically out major and minor officials, and then ordinary citizens, tax states, and finally ending with the fringe of the barbarians. So this concept is closely associated with civilization and order in Chinese classical philosophy, and form the basis for the world view of the Chinese people and nations. So it's interesting, and this Tianxia also includes a vast sphere, not only of China, but Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. They use the concept But what is important, I have only 5 minutes. I brought a lot of quotes from Confucius and Mencius, and I wouldn't have, I will have to pick up one or two to read for you. But this concept, understand also that the Tianxia comprehends also the Son of Heavens. The Son of Heavens is the Emperor. And the Emperor has to follow, first, to be benevolent, as said Confucius. But not only that, not only benevolent, but to do what they need to do to be accepted by the people. And the interesting thing is that if the Emperor, the Son of Heavens, if he doesn't follow the attributes that he has to do for the people, to look for the waters, to look for the housings, to look, he can be dismissed. And this is a very interesting so the ruler who pursues this figure, this chart shows the ruler who pursues justice or profit. And so the ruler, speaking of justice, seeking the human way, benevolent government, human authority, and the ruler is speaking of hegemonic, speaking of profit, seeking the hegemonic way, hegemonic government, and it ups and to decline. So I pick up, I am finishing, 3 visions of 3 influential Chinese authors. The first one is Yan Shuetong, which is a realist author. And he says that he was formed in the United States, Harvard, I guess, and he's a kind of positivistic thinker. And he says that it makes no sense for a Chinese to try a theory, to elaborate a theory, own theory of international relations. He says, there is a debate in China about whether we should create a Chinese theory of international. Because of my training in Berkeley, I have to be strongly influenced by scientific methodology and believe that it is a misguided approach. But at least he said by the end of his writings that it's necessary to afford to comprehend many of the concepts of the ancient thinkers of China. Okay. The Qin, sorry for the pronunciation, accept the thesis. No? I try to find key dynamics underpinning of the Chinese way, integrating Oriental ideas and concepts, reinterpreting them in the light of established theory and problems. The interpretation is based upon a Chinese understanding, a Chinese way of thinking, a Chinese worldview. So, Qin, and the third one is Zhao Tingyang is a philosopher. Zhao Tingyang is a very radical in the sort of appropriating and creating a new Chinese approach to international relations. He says categorically that Chinese theory makes sense. Zhao can enroll in 2 streams. He does a very critical idea about the Western. He said that the Western never saw the world as Tianxia, but state nation was the main purpose of the Western, to think the world. And he said the concept of Tianxia is a very strong contribution for the humanity, for the actual civilization, because it thinks really about the world, the needs of the world. And he speaks a lot of the crisis that we are living and we are confronting in terms of environmental, in terms of concentration of income, in terms of maintaining the instability, which is today considered by even Stiglitz or others, authors in economy. 1 minute. He says, the all under heaven theory is a more appropriate principle for a world theory than an international theory, which is centered. So I'm very constrained here because I would have much more things to present. This is a dilemma that Zhao, and he talks about, because even Mao Zedong talking about the West and China. China to develop its economy, its society, has to imitate the West. And for him, for Zhao, it's time to start to change this modernization, or we have to try a new mission. There are many questions to be answered by the future. People have asked more about the Chinese values, always misunderstood and mistranslated. This is a problem, and by that reason I quote Said in the beginning of the work. So we have to understand the construction, the mental construction, the psychology of how the Chinese understand, and not to judge them or to try to understand them by our principles, our premises. An important issue launched by the philosopher, China so far is one of the successful examples of modernization, but it has a lot of problems in the environment problems and so on. But this has deepened on the imitation of the Western powers. So now it's I cannot follow these. I can send the PowerPoint for who is interested. So the principle, very important and very keen, sharp questions that are discussed in our political science in the West, and questions like legitimacy and many others, how the government has to behave for the people and so on, that we just, to finish, to conclude, they say from Confucius that the government has to act like a family, where the ruler has to be benevolent. The family is the minimum irreducible home of harmony, cooperation, common interest, and happiness. And all the today foreign relations of China is talking about harmony all the time. Where you go, you go to Beijing Forum, there is the word of harmony taking places. And I hope that Tianxia can be practiced by the Chinese, and with this component of the ancient, because I think that we in the Western, the capitalist system, I think that is broke, and it broke in 2008, no? But we cannot continue to do some malaise all over, not only in the environment, but also with all in democracy. The spirit of democracy is completely broken down. It's the main phrase, main concept in the Western thought, but it's broke because the state is completely controlled by the multinationals, by the big capital, and so on. So I think that we have to think more deeply, more seriously about the ancient comprehension of Tianxia. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Renato Costa. By the way, UFPE means Federal University of Pernambuco, for the ones that don't know. Okay, so our next speaker is Renato Flores. Renato works at the International Intelligence Unit at FGV, Fundación Getúlio Vargas of Rio de Janeiro. His interests include development, economics, sustainable growth, trade, and the analytics of risk. He has contributions also on regional integration in general, but also in comparison with the European Union. And he recently edited a manual on regional integration. So welcome, Renato, and you also have 25 minutes.
Theoretically, yes. Would you light? I can't see the people. It's very annoying. There are no lights here. I see shadows in front of me. And I don't know how to speak to shadows. I would say more there and there. Oh, it's getting better. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, good afternoon. Contrary to the previous talk, which was so enlightening, we always learn with the Chinese. So I just learned that impeachment was created by old political scientists from China. That was very interesting. I'm going to use this. And my talk is very pragmatic. So I'll be very practical. And summing up, what I want to say is that, my friends, the Jaguar has broken teeth. The Jaguar is very timid. So that's why I said reversing the rhetoric. Because we only say, come Chinese, come Indians, put your money here, do this for us, do this, do that for us. But we don't have an active attitude. So I'm preaching or pledging or arguing for Brazil and other countries also be more aggressive, to revert a bit this rhetoric and go to China, go to India. Of course, it's understandable why we have this attitude as any developing country or emerging nation, which is a very, very beautiful Chinese-like concept. We want money, we want foreign direct investment as everybody. And given that there are wonderful prospects still of growth in China and India, we want to attract them. But we also should be proactive. So that's the main point I want to talk and I want to emphasize. And what can we do? Well, I'm not going to present any new idea. I'm going to start with a good old concept, which is trade. There is still a lot of room for trade from Brazil to India and to China. And we forget this. As I said, we are with crossed arms, waiting for the Chinese and the Indians to come. Most welcome, but we should go there also. So if you look at trade, just to begin with, there's still scope in trading goods. The average tariff, we must say that both countries have been liberalizing their economy, have been doing, I would say, very positive efforts in this direction, but taking data from 3 to 5 years ago, which I think are still valid, the average tariff in India for agricultural goods is 41.6%. It's a very high tariff. In China, 21.9%. For manufacturers in India, 10.7, and China 11.9. Well, so there is a scope for selling things. And what to sell? In our case, food, always and ever. There is enormous market for different kinds of food. Of course, if I look at a Chinese friend, I think of meat. The dream of the Brazilian agribusiness is that every Chinese eats 1 beef per month. If this happens, that's paradise for us, and we should fight for this. If I look to my Indian friends, I would be more careful about meat, though I know, and my friend from ORF has also invited me to invite him to a good churrasco. So, but there are other things, there are fruits, there are cereals. So food, other things, consumption goods. We're very good at consumption goods. Clothing, household appliances, and so on. Taking China, for instance, China needs to develop internal consumption. Again, and the same applies to India with different nuances. But in terms of clothing, for instance, the domestic industry of China, which exports a lot, is not able to supply clothing for the whole middle class, which has been growing. They need to import clothing. They need to import household appliances. So we have to be active. We have to ask for better tariffs, better treatment. There is also trade deviation in both countries due to preferential agreements with their neighbors. This is especially with India. Indians, as we all know, are always very clever. So in spite of all the problems, very sad problems sometimes, with the neighbors, they have preferential agreements with Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and there are even interesting studies. Marcel is not here anymore. Well, it's the fall of the afternoon. But IPEA has done very interesting studies showing that there is trade deviation with regard to our potential trade flows to India, which is due to the preferential agreements of India with its neighbors. So one thing that we could ask our Indian friends is, why don't you give us the same preferences you give to your neighbors? We are friends, we love each other, we are BRICS members. No? As young boys and girls know, love needs something to go on. No? So what about a preferential agreement from time to time? There is also another problem still remaining in the trade realm: non-tariff barriers. I would say that if you take India, China, and if you add Brazil, we are the masters of non-tariff barriers. Though also our German friends, they are good at that. Though, let us say, they do it in a more elegant way, maybe, I'm not sure. But anyhow, and the problem, what is the main non-tariff barrier in China and India? It is red tape. It is red tape. You get crazy if you want to sell something in India. You get crazy as well if you want to sell something in China. And you get mad sometimes if you want to sell something in Brazil. So we need trade facilitation. That's very important. And our businessmen who are waiting money from heaven in this case China and India, should go there and also fight for a trade facilitation agreement. Everybody would be happy, by the way. So my first point is this: there is scope for doing a lot as regards trade. Trading goods, I'm not even mentioning trading services. The Indians will be very happy. They are very performing in services. They have a wide market here, and they are penetrating already here. So while we are crying and sitting and looking at the beautiful Ipanema They are coming here. The Chinese people talk about the Chinese, but the Indians, every year, they increase their participation in our economy and they increase their exports to Brazil. Fine, they are right. We should do the same. So first point, trade. There is a scope and there is a lot of passive behavior from Brazil. The second point is what I would call investment and platforms. This is very important. We have multinationals. Asia is not the market of the future, is the market of the present. Our multinationals, our performing exporters need to think every minute of every day about Asia. We need a presence in Asia. We have tried, and the examples are not very encouraging, I would say. For instance, Embraer tried a FDI in China. Given that, according to Tianxia, I'm not going into detail of what happened to Embraer investment in China, but we couldn't say that it was successful. It was, let us say, as my Indian friends say, an unfortunate experience. So we learned a lot, but we should still try again, go on trying. In India, on the other hand, in the case of Embraer, Embraer was more careful. Embraer did no FDI, but they set up a platform in India, very successful. You know, Indians like very much good and expensive things. Indian executives buy a lot of executive jets from Embraer. It's a huge market for Embraer. And based in India, they started to sell very successfully in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Southeast Asia. Maybe this is the right way to penetrate in this market instead of FDI. But for other ones, for instance, Marco Polo, a very successful exporter of buses and transport equipment, wants to set up a plant there. A bit, let us say, half scared by the adventure of Embraer in China, they eventually chose Malaysia, if I'm not mistaken, and Vietnam. Of course, Vietnamese found it wonderful but to have a plant to be chosen instead of China. So we should learn to play with this. Okay? Both China can be a place for FDI, and I think that both sides are learning. The Chinese nowadays are more open to FDI than they were. When I say open, they have always been open, but in a very specific, in a very peculiar Chinese way. Now they are in a way that it's, let us say, it's simpler for a foreigner to a certain extent. So we shouldn't give up China. India, in spite of the red tape, also would be willing to, I can give you examples that the Indians would like to have, and also the idea of platform. Because we must think of Asia. Of course, if you are in India, you can reach a certain market. If you are in China, you can reach another market. These two markets have an intersection, let us say, theoretically, mathematically, in the middle of Southeast Asia. You don't need to go to China, but if you have good relations in China, you establish yourself in Singapore, and you go to China. If you establish yourself in India, you can reach Pakistan, because I'm sure that relations will improve every year. You can reach Pakistan, you can reach other countries. So I think the idea of combining either FDI or the platform is very, very important. Well, there are ancillary things to these measures. One, which has been mentioned by my other colleague, is to increase knowledge. for doing this, we should multiply by 10 business fairs, business meetings, events. I have the great pleasure to be planning with my great friend, the Honorable Indian Ambassador, an annual meeting of Indian and Brazilian entrepreneur, businessmen, to get together and know each other and get to know what are their interests. What do the Indians want here? How could we help them? No, wonderful, we want them here. Fertilizers, chemical compounds, but also, what do Brazilian businessmen want in India? And how could our Indian partners help us? I give a very interesting example which I learned 1 month ago. You take China and Russia, a relationship which has ups and downs. You know how many trade fairs exist per year between China and Russia? 10. 10. In spite of a border problem, in spite whether one leader is in good humor, the other is in bad humor, no problem. 10 trade fairs at least per year. Doing business. Chinese go there and show things adapted to the Russian market, and the Russians do the same, written in Mandarin. We should do the same. We should promote more business meetings and interactions here. Finally, another thing which may seem more elusive are rich, big, encompassing outside endeavors. It was mentioned here, OBOR, One Belt, One Road. The One Belt, One Road initiative is a very interesting initiative, as everything the Chinese think about. So you don't know how many years or decades it will take. It's a kind of unending effort, but an effort which opens a lot of opportunities for foreign companies. They will need foreign help to build up the whole infrastructure and all the things they want to do. Indians are much more discreet, but don't think that they don't have ambitious projects. They have highly ambitious projects. So we should discover opportunities in these huge endeavors from these both countries. They will need construction firms, engineering, design, software, logistics, plenty of things. And there will be room for Brazilian firms. So, well, you need diplomacy, you need connections, and this takes time and takes money. But doing business takes money. That's why things sometimes are so expensive. So my third suggestion is engaging in these huge efforts, very ambitious efforts, that both countries will pursue in the next years. And this has also a spillover, which is very important. We all need infrastructure. China still needs a lot of infrastructure. India as well, Brazil as well. So for certain areas like infrastructure, we could develop common ways of working. PPPs, why not? It's possible to have PPPs with Brazilian partners, Brazilian providers. And of course, these are both two-way roads. Once you open, the Chinese or the Indians open this possibility, they want to participate here. And this is called integration. This is called active, positive integration. So, I would like to stop here. I think that that's amazing. I always break my time in 20 to 30 minutes, so don't be afraid. I think that today is not the case, and I would like to hear your views to my points. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Actually, you had 4 more minutes, so I will leave it to you for the answers.
Okay.
So our next speaker is Nele Noesselt. She's a professor of political science with a special focus on China, East Asia at the University of Duisburg. She has a PhD in modern Chinese studies in political science and a postdoc qualification in political science too. From 2009 to 2011, she was an assistant professor with a focus on Chinese politics at the University of Göttingen. Apart from that, Dr. Noesselt has been a research fellow at the Giga Institute of Asian Studies, a spokesman at Giga Research Team Comparative Regionalism Research, and part of the editorial team of Journal of Current Chinese Affairs. So it's a pleasure to have her today. She's right next to me.
Yeah, so thanks a lot to the organizers for putting these very fascinating panels together. With all these different perspectives, we just had a neo-realist one, then we had the more abstract political philosophy approach. I'm just checking where can I find my PPT? Okay, so I just start.
And then we will. We don't find it. After. Oh.
Ok, tá ligado.
Tá. Vai levar aqui nesse jeito.
Saiu pela pergunta. You can use this one.
Okay, so thanks a lot for your patience. We are back to China and Latin America, and actually I have to say the first presentation of this panel was actually a topic that I've been working on for quite some years, so the Chinese School of International Relations. And then we had a second presentation also mentioning OBOR, the One Belt, One Road initiative, and actually both topics are somehow linked to what I prepared for you. So please allow me to skip some slides. And what I officially have to present today is China's global financial positioning strategy in Latin America. And the background is that I worked for quite some years on the rather philosophical approach to, well, world order as seen from a Chinese perspective. So I read those works by Xing Yang, Qin Yaqing, and so on. But the problem is that those works just count for less than 2% of all publications in Chinese on IR. So it's rather a small group of scholars working on that, and the major issue is that it's not applied. So it might be a cognitive mind map, I agree, I fully agree. So it might inspire people when they think about China's global ambitions. But it's not the major focus of publications that you can find in Chinese journals. So that's why I try to move to a more concrete field, which is finance, and as a case study, Latin America. And one starting point here is that we had many presentations today already on China, Latin America, and we had those trade figures, and I was really impressed to see how these lines went up and down, and that we see that, well, we have an impact of the global financial crisis. But we normally look at Sino-Latin American relations as a closed shop. Okay, so we look at official government statements, or we look at official trade figures, but we don't open this black box. And we have many more actors than just the government, or just the big enterprises. So that's why I would like to bring banks in. And normally banks are seen as private actors, as well, apart from the state, apart from government. But in this case here, banks are somehow included into the PRC's global positioning strategy and the regional development plans for Latin American countries. Latin American countries, once again, it's not one region, it's a region composed of many actors. And so here, that's just a brief overview, Chinese investments and contracts in South America. And you have a total number of 125 billion US dollars. And just to compare, here we have those investments in the US, and the total value is 80 billion US dollars. And what you can learn from this comparative approach is, well, it's pretty hard for Chinese enterprises and also Chinese banks to get into the US American market. That is also why they are really interested in expanding their trade relations, expanding their investments with Latin American countries. And maybe some of you still remember that we had a case in 2009 when a Chinese company tried to take over Unicom, a really big oil company in the US, and US Senate, they intervened. I said, it's national interest, we are not going to sell it to you, because then we would depend on the Chinese government's decisions, and so we can't agree. Finally, in the past few months, I think they reached an agreement, they reached a deal. But for many US companies, cooperation, kind of a partnership with Chinese enterprises is a thing that doesn't really work. Because they try, as you said, they try to defend their national interests, and they are afraid that by cooperating they might also lose their kind of technological superiority, their innovation capacity. So China is turning to Latin America in order to find new markets. And they tried the same, I have to say, in Europe. Because in Europe also we have this kind of division into Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And it was much easier to enter the Eastern European market and then to turn from Eastern European countries to the common integrated market. Because Western European countries are not interested in having new contracts with Chinese enterprises. It changed after the outbreak of the financial crisis. Okay, so that's the starting point for China. There's a strategic interest in expanding cooperation with Latin America. And when they started expanding cooperation, I have to say I talked to many think tanks in Beijing. They first of all had to revise their interpretation, the understanding of Latin America. And that brings me back also to philosophy, because for quite some time Latin America was just treated as Latin America, an integrated region far beyond the civilized world. And then they certainly had to engage in more research and more exchange with universities and think tanks in Latin America, and they found out, okay, it's composed of various countries, independent nation states, and while the size is different, the resources they provide is different, and so we have to diversify our strategy for coping with Latin America. And although they have one policy paper on Sino-Latin American relations, only one. It hasn't been updated so far, and there it's still one region. It's not going to discuss a white paper.
Yeah.
It's not going to discuss all these different bilateral relationships. But think tanks in China, they are aware of those different national conditions of those Latin American countries, and so they expanded their investment and their finance to Latin America. And already in 2010. They loaned more to that region, to Latin America as such, as the World Bank, IDB, and US Export-Import Bank combined. That's quite a lot. And of course, you have a year, 2010, it's after the outbreak of the financial crisis. So normally, when you try to understand China's global strategy, you will always come to the point that China is not going to seek hegemony, to seek a kind of leadership. They are moving in, but they see a strategic window of opportunity. That means when they move to Africa, they tried first of all to sign contracts with those countries that are sanctioned or excluded from the Western markets. Because there still was space to kind of extend their activities, because no other state is moving in. And they did the same in Latin America. They did kind of an overview, a mapping, and try to find out in which countries there was a kind of visible decline of US investment, and then they moved in. And so I would agree, they're not going to pursue an offensive approach, assertive approach. It is rather they come in and provide certain goods, and if the other side agrees, that's fine, then we have a deal. And even to give you some more background figures, then we have China not only as a new investor to Latin America, but also China as an investor that cooperates with certain regional sub-institutions. So we have the CELAC meeting, for example, and China is investing quite a lot in this group of states. And in 2015, China's finance to LAC surpassed once again World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank lending to that region, to that sub-region. So China is becoming more important, and the strategy behind is going to be adapted, justified, and kind of presented also to the Chinese public as something that China has to do in order to keep its own national economy stable. So, because you already mentioned this part, this economic output dimension, the Chinese government always has to justify its foreign strategy vis-à-vis its own population.
Yes.
And that's what they do. They explain, well, there's no other way to stabilize our economic growth than, well, expanding more, going global. And going global doesn't mean to attack other people, to attack other countries. It's more like searching for strategic winners to engage. And that's somehow in line with the Confucian ideas of harmony, of, well, win-win situations. So when you look at the states, the countries where China is investing in Latin America, well, you can see there are a number of loans with Venezuela, with Brazil also, and the amount is quite high. But if you compare it to other countries' investments, it's still not really impressive. Okay, but they have started to position themselves as new lenders, new creditors. But then the question is, who are they, the Chinese? Are we speaking of, well, China as a kind of government, or the party state, or is it Chinese companies? Then do we speak of well, state-owned companies or private companies? When you look at investment in the US, you can see that the major increase in investment is done by private companies. Whereas in Latin America, a big part is still by state-owned companies, although on paper they might look like private companies. So you really have to go into details. And in addition to state-owned companies at the central state level, you find many, many enterprises that are local enterprises. So you see an increased competition between different types of Chinese enterprises and companies. And you see an increased competition between the central government and the local government, the provincial government, that also try to kind of enrich their partnerships with certain states or regions. And you find banks as new players in that game. And so why do we talk about banks? Why are they so important? Well, banks in China are not banked as you know them from your own, well, democratic, liberal economies. They are state-owned, and so you see kind of a round-tripping capital where one bank lends money to another bank, but all these banks are still state-controlled. And so when you look at where China, well, China is a huge compound of various actors, invests, you see, well, it's the energy sector, it's about raw materials, energy, oil, gas, and so on.
Is this in Latin America or overall?
That's just in Latin America. And it's just the figures that are the official ones, so it might be different when you really start counting. Sometimes the Chinese statistics are not really reliable, but it applies to every type of national statistic. So infrastructure is a huge field where China has started to invest, and that's what you just mentioned. China needs to build up its own infrastructure, but they've done a good job. And now they have overcapacities and they try to export.
Yes.
And what they do, on the other hand, is also that they have huge currency reserves. And they are, of course, controlled by banks and by special agencies that are linked to banks. And one strategy in order to keep China stable is to invest in other regions and other countries, but to make sure that money is going back to China. Okay, so if they provide certain loans, certain credit lines, they have the other side signing a contract that this money is given to a Chinese company. Okay, so they are sending the workers over, having them done this construction work, and then, well, this money is never leaving China. It's kind of circulating inside the Chinese monetary system. But by doing this, by building up infrastructure based on Chinese credit lines and, well, operationalized and implemented by Chinese workers, they manage even to increase China's monetary power. So why is it so important to increase China's monetary power? Well, monetary power is first of all based on currency reserves, but also on your share of global investment. And if you have monetary power, you have of course the right to speak up and right to articulate your own interests in bilateral relations, but also on the global level. And we just recently had the inclusion of the renminbi, the Chinese renminbi, into the currency basket of the International Monetary Fund. And that of course means that the renminbi is becoming an international currency. And in 2009, when we had this global crisis in Europe and the US, so the banking crisis and the economic downturn, the head of the People's Bank of China, which is not an independent bank, there it's directly linked to the party state. He came up with a proposal to substitute the US dollar by first of all a combination of different national currencies. And so it's somehow linked to China's official vision of global affairs. The world should be composed of multiple poles, of multiple power centers. And if the world is composed of poles, not just the US and China, but even more to counterbalance all these interests, then the monetary system should also be composed of various currencies, strong currencies. And so for China that was a major, well, issue, because if you internationalize your currency, that's also what Japan did in the 1980s, then you might become more dependent on the market, the global financial markets. And so, as far as my knowledge, the renminbi is now the only currency that is not directly, well, measured by the market, but it still has a fixed exchange rate, but it's nevertheless included into the basket of the IMF. It's the first time in history. And for China, that was the only way to agree having such an inclusion, because otherwise they could be manipulated by, well, maybe the US, maybe other Western powers. So they try to be independent, but to be a major player in the global economy and the global finance. And as you can see here on that slide, well, energy is of course still important, but infrastructure, that means investment, is the biggest share in Latin America. And we have all these construction works, so high-speed roads, roads and railroads, they're building hospitals, and so on, and so on, and so on. So they export certain goods, and you have two levels, two dimensions associated with these construction works. One level is that they need the infrastructure to transport, well, raw materials, resources to China, to ship them to China. The other thing is, of course, if they build up hospitals or if they help to modernize the railroad system also in Africa, where all these European powers are rather reluctant to modernize the already existing railroads. Well, they try and they manage to establish a kind of positive image of China as a benevolent and, well, peaceful power, and not as a hegemonic power center. So that's part of their own national story, the nation branding. We had it with you, the presentation in the morning. You spoke about branding, so nation branding. So here we are. So if you now take a closer look at banks, we still have 5 minutes.
8? No, 10?
10, that's fine. So if you take a closer look at banks, and I have to say I did all these interviews in the last few months in China, but I'm not going to give you all the details. I'll try to summarize it in a few sentences. So we have, as one actor, we have China Development Bank active in all Latin American countries. They have, according to their own kind of agenda, 8 fields of activities, starting from electric power and ending with infrastructure. That are the fields that this bank should be engaged in, according to the official master plan. Then we have a big actor, the China Export-Import Bank, which is rather responsible for the overarching frame, so interbank loans, credits, overseas construction work, and so on. So you see a separation of labor on paper. In reality, they compete. And those two should be policy banks. What does it mean? Well, just try to summarize this. So we have China Development Bank, CDB, and China Exim Bank. And in the 1990s, when China started to modernize its financial structures, the banking system, they tried to establish these two as policy banks and tried to give other services just to the big four. So the big four state-owned banks. So this separation of responsibilities should allow China to become a more or less normal state, to engage in normal bilateral economic financial interactions with Latin America, for example. But in fact, all these banks are still competing. There's no separation between policy banks and normal banks. And just to give you one example, because it's related with Brazil, ICBC, one of the big 4 banks that we do have, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, entered into the market, into kind of agreements with local enterprises in May 2015. And so they're directly competing with Exim Bank and China Development Bank, and they're providing unconditional loans and try to influence also the exports towards China by not only providing loans and credit lines, but by telling the other companies, their partners, what China might need. So we just had this track 2 diplomacy in your presentation, so it's also what banks do. It's not just that the government of China is going to Latin America to communicate, it's also what China can do via its state-owned banks. And so in Mexico, we also have ICBC, and altogether ICBC is operating in 4 countries in Latin America. And I just took it from the website because they are mentioning at the opening ceremony, when they had this new cooperation with Mexico, the vice chairman of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is kind of the unofficial second chamber of the parliament, the unofficial one. He was also there to participate in this opening ceremony. That means it's not just an agreement between a bank, an independent bank, and another government or another enterprise. It's a state act here. So it's part of China's official diplomacy. And that, of course, leads me to the Silk Road. If China is now also pushing its banks to engage globally, well, then obviously their strategy has changed. They're no longer just focusing on domestic construction work or on domestic growth and domestic stability. They're going global under the 5th generation. And so the Silk Road has already been mentioned. So we have 2 lines. We have the one passing through Central Asia and the one running through the South China Sea. And officially, they argue that it's kind of a remake of the ancient, the historical Silk Road. But for those studying history, of course, you see it's not the same. It's not the same Silk Road. So the question is, okay, so why do they operate the Silk Road if obviously it's not a historical return, or not a return to ancient times? Well, there are 2 explanations I got from my Chinese partners. One explanation is, we have the China's red theory. China is rising, China is assertive, China is aggressive, so we should contain China. Okay, so if China now presents its own investment strategy as part of an old Silk Road and manages to have a positive narrative ascribed to the old Silk Road, then of course it's not a threat. Okay, they're trying to counterbalance negative threat perception.
Yes.
And if that's the case, so it's soft power, it's nation branding and soft power, then the question is, so why don't we have Latin America on that map? Okay, even the New Silk Road ends in, Africa on the one side and Europe on the other, and so Latin America is not on the official map. But when you talk to people, Latin America is included. And if Latin America is included, and that's also a semi-official quote, that China's grand strategy is to facilitate global trade via infrastructure projects, and it's running through Eurasia and Eastern Africa, but informally. However, it also aims to tie Latin America into the system. Okay, but why only informally? Because we just had this debate, if China is moving into Latin America, that might counterbalance US influence, and that might lead to a struggle about the domination or predominant positioning in the US strategic backyard. And so China is still aware that there are many, many negative stories kind of ascribed or associated with China's rise. So Latin America is in this global strategy, but it's not mentioned, it's not on the map of the Silk Road. And that's an explanation I got from various think tanks in Beijing. So you can be lucky, you are not excluded, okay, that's a good story. But the problem is, of course, if one region or a group of states is not officially included, you don't get the official narrative, what they expect or what they are kind of coining as a new kind of roadmap for bilateral interactions. So just to come to the first end of my presentation, if you try to understand China's foreign strategy and the role of banks, first of all, we have to keep in mind that all those investment activities by independent actors, and we would normally count banks as independent, profit-maximizing actors, are somehow part of a global strategy. In this case, because they are state-owned, they are state-controlled. And also the internationalization of the renminbi is a state-controlled action. And they are quite aware that the high-speed internationalization of the Japanese yen was not really in favor of the Japanese economy. That's why they're really trying to control the internationalization of the Chinese currency. But what they offer to many of their partners along the Silk Road is that trade and investment and loans can be paid and repaid in national currencies. And in the long run, of course, it would be the renminbi and not the other national currency. They have those currency swap agreements, okay, but in the long run, they would like to shift it. And maybe for those of you studying history of political economy, you are familiar with the rise of the US and the rise of the US dollar after the Second World War. And one explanation why after the end of the Bretton Woods system and the gold standard of the US dollar, the US still managed to keep this power position is, then they linked it to the oil market. So we had the petro dollar. And currently, China has managed to reach new agreements with oil-producing states that they can use the renminbi, so the yuan, instead of the US dollar. So China is trying to build the petro-yuan as part of its global strategy. That's what they do with Angola, what they do with Venezuela. And that probably means if Latin American countries are dealing with China and they kind of accept new currencies, they become more dependent on China's economy. And on the other hand, China is trying to remain and to stay independent from turbulences that might occur in Latin America by not having the yuan based on market mechanisms. And they are pretty clever in doing this, or pursuing this dual approach, having it internationalized on the one hand, having it kind of integrated in bilateral interaction, but still being the ones to decide how to fix or where to fix the exchange rates. And we have a multiplicity of actors involved, and that's a major issue and a major kind of challenge for China's national government, because you can't control what all your different actors at the different levels are doing. And even though we have the official national declarations, okay, the Chinese government expects or wishes or plans to, you never know what your private companies or private partners might have in mind. And so it's pretty tough to talk about Sino-Latin American relations just as one integrated framework. It's not possible. And so, as a final conclusion, we have a multi-dimensional dynamic game with multiplicity, plurality of actors, and it's not just a unidirectional engagement. And if you, from the Latin American point of view, would like to engage with China, probably you have to keep in mind it's not just a give and take, it's rather a multi-level strategic exchange of goods and ideas. And that brings me to your point, the theory of international relations. Well, even though only a few people in China are working with this theory, we find many approaches to international relations that somehow reflect a different strategic planning. And so it might be really important not just to look at trade figures, what we did also in this morning, but also to include this invisible dimension of interactions between those two regions or different bilateral partnerships. Thanks for the attention. Looking forward to your questions.